guys, today is such a good day. You have no idea. First of all, it's raining, which is my favorite thing ever, and I get to wear like cozy sweaters, so that makes the day great right off the bat. But second of all, we get to sew today, and the project that I have dreamed up for us turned out like 50 times better than I was hoping. So I am extremely excited to jump into it. If you've been following along, this is part of my Learn to Sew beginner sewing series. This is episode 5 in the series. So episode 1 was sewing tools that I recommend for beginners. Episode 2 was all about fabric. Episode 3 was how to use your machine, a little bit about sergers. Episode 4 was a deep dive into patterns. And then today we are going to do a beginner sewing project. So the whole point of today is to give you a project that you can do if you've never sewn anything before, but if you have sewn before, even if you're like an expert sewist, I designed this project to still be fun and cute. So we're going to be making a bag today. Let me show you my example bag. Don't look too closely. I made this yesterday as my example and I'm tweaking a couple little things, but this is the overall vibe of what we're going for today. It's a pretty simple, basic tote bag, but we added a few extra elements to make it especially fun, and I'm gonna go through a lot of options that you can do to kind of make it your own. Because obviously not everybody has the same needs in their bag or taste. Different people just like different things. So the way that I have designed this bag is to solve my needs, make it cute, but also make it extremely simple and straightforward so that if you are a beginner, you can totally easily follow along. Let me give you a little tour. My hope and dream for making a bag is to be my supply bag for my yarn and crochet stuff. I've been on a crochet journey recently, which has been very fun. And I need a good bag that can hold all my stuff so I can take it to like my kids' soccer practice, or it can sit in my living room or wherever, like just bring it around with me while I'm working on my crochet projects. So that's what I am using it for. So I wanted a bag that was big enough to hold yarn, like it has plenty of space, but it isn't like overwhelmingly huge. Let me show you a better angle here. It sits pretty flat, like it's not super imposing, but when it's filled up, it's empty right now, but when it's filled up with yarn, like it can hold quite a bit. I also wanted a bag that had a true flat bottom so that when it is filled up with yarn, I can set it down on the ground or on a tabletop or whatever, and it doesn't fall over. The inside has quite a few pockets, and that's one thing that we'll kind of go over in the construction of tailoring the pockets to what you want them to be. The part that I am the most excited about is these patches that I have put on the front. So this is a pocket here, and on the front, I've made these little fun flower patches. Now, I think these ones are cute. They were the first ones that I've ever done, so I learned a lot in the process, and I'm gonna show you how I did them. But just you wait until you see the patches I'm doing today. You might be able to see them in the background. I'm gonna get to those in a minute. But basically, I wanted to add some sort of decorative element to the bag that would make it unique and make it kind of fun, but is completely optional. I would say this is like a step above beginner. It's very easy. We're gonna walk through it. If you wanna do it, you totally can, and it's gonna be wonderful and fine. If you just wanna focus on the bag itself and not worry about extra things, that's great too, and you can just skip past this portion. I'm gonna walk through patches right at the beginning of construction, and so you can just skip over that if you don't wanna do any sort of patch. I will say I really went nuts on inspo for the patches because I couldn't decide what I wanted to do. So I have a whole Pinterest board where I pinned a bunch of design ideas. There's like flowers on there, there's letters on there, there's like fruit, and just different fun design element things. So I'm gonna link that Pinterest board if you like the idea of doing patches, but you don't know what you wanna do. I have a bunch of ideas for you. So I wanna talk about options that you can do to kind of change up the bag before I show you what we're doing today. I really want you to be able to look at this bag and make it your own in your design and inspo process. In fact, speaking of Pinterest, I would highly recommend making a Pinterest board for the bag that you're going to make and kind of think through both the design elements that you like as far as your taste goes, but also what do you plan to use the bag for? And that will kind of help guide what version you want to make. So as for things that can be easily changed, size is one thing that you could totally fudge the size on. Everything we're cutting out today is just rectangles. So you can adjust any of the pattern pieces to be any size you want. If you wanna make like a little mini tote bag, or you wanna make like something with super long straps that's more like crossbody, or you want to make like the base bigger and have it be like a really, really wide base or whatever. You can kind of adjust the proportions to whatever you want to be. You can obviously just follow along with exactly what we're doing today if you wanna keep it simple, but feel free to like adjust the size. The inside pockets are another thing that are going to be very easy to switch up. I'm just doing mine extremely simply, but I'm going to be sectioning off the pockets into things that I want to use the bag for. For example, I'm going to be doing some like skinny little pockets because I want spaces for my crochet hooks to sit in. So again, feel free to change things up, change the pockets however you want to. I know some people like having closures at the top of their bag. For my purposes, I didn't really need it. And again, I wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So you could experiment with maybe doing some sort of like snap closure at the top. It would be pretty easy to add like a bow here maybe, that you could tie a bow at the top. Bows are also a very like popular trend right now. So if you wanted to add bows to your bag, it would be super simple to maybe put some like ribbon bows at the straps here or on the ends of the bag. I have a different bag tutorial that walks through how to kind of add a bow to a bag. So I'll link that if you're interested in putting bows on yours. I was also very highly considering making a quilted version as well, because it would be extremely easy. The construction is basically the same. If you wanted to use a pre-made quilt or quilt your own material to make a tote bag, it would be very, very simple. I was going to do it in this video too and do both versions. I felt like that was probably overwhelming. So if you're interested in a tutorial for a quilted tote, basically the same thing but quilted, let me know, because I'm totally up for doing a separate video on that. Okay, so the version of the bag we're making today, it's gonna be the same style and dimensions and all of that stuff. But the vibes that I really want to go for are like 90s mom, kindergarten teacher, craft person. Can you like picture the aesthetic I'm thinking of? I also really wanted the patches to be like little strawberries. You may be able to see them in the background, but I'll show you a little close up here so you can see what we're working with so far. So I've cut out all these little strawberries. I'm going to show you how I did them and how we're going to attach them to the bag so you can follow along with me. So I have those strawberry patches, and then the fabric that I'm using for the main part of the bag is just a canvas duck cloth that I got from Joanne. I'll link that in the description. I would give it like a 7 out of 10. I feel like it's a pretty good canvas. I have some tote bags that I've just like bought that I like the material of a little bit more, but this one works fine. So for your main body of the bag, you can use like a canvas duck cloth material like this, or you can use a different material. I would recommend doing something that's either medium weight to heavy weight. And it's not going to ruin anything if you do a lighter weight fabric. Your bag will just be much floppier. So you just need to think through, again, like what kind of bag you want, what needs you have for the bag. For me, because I wanted it to stand up when I set it down, right? If it's like full of yarn, I don't want it to be like flopping all over the place. I really wanted to make sure I got a heavier weight fabric. I believe this one is 10-ounce fabric. And if you watched my fabric deep dive video, which was episode 2, we talked about fabric weights in there in depth. So I would recommend for the main body of the bag, I would try to get something between maybe 7 to 12-ounce fabric. I wouldn't go lighter than that, and any heavier than that might make construction sort of annoying, but it's really up to you, whatever you want to do. So again, this is like a 10-ounce canvas. I think it's 10 ounce, it might be 12. I'll look it up. So that's the main fabric that I'm using. And don't worry, I'm gonna tell you all the pieces you need to cut out in just a second. There's also a lining for the bag. For my lining, I have this really cute strawberry fabric that I got that I will also link. I got it from Fluid Plus Drape, and I chose it 99% for vibes because, again, there's strawberries on the outside, right? And I feel like it is giving crafty mom vibes a little bit, which I love. However, it is more of a flowy, light to mid-weight fabric. I'd have to look up how many ounces it is. But my recommendation for the lining would try to be like a mid-weight fabric. Anywhere from like 4 to 7 ounces is probably the sweet spot. I would guess this might be like 3 or 4 ounces. It's a lot more like flowy and lightweight than I would probably want it to be, but it's just so cute that I can't resist. So my lining is gonna be a bit floppier, but since I have the thicker canvas on the outside, it's going to be fine. But really the biggest thing with the lining fabric being floppy is that the pockets are gonna be pretty floppy, but for my needs, I'm making my pockets pretty small. So if they were bigger pockets, I might be more worried about it. I feel like having slightly floppy pockets, how many times can I freaking say that, is worth it for the cute vibes of the fabric. So that's the lining fabric I'm using. And then for the straps, I had a stroke of genius as I was going through all of my fabric last night. I had a teeny bit of this denim left over that I believe is 10-ounce denim, but it's like a really nice, like good texture denim, and it's extremely 90s mom jeans vibes, which is perfect for what I'm going for. So these are going to be the straps. So those are the 3 fabrics I have. Now, as far as fabric requirements, it obviously depends a lot on if you're like changing the size of anything or how wide the bolt of your fabric is. But roughly, I am using for my main and lining fabrics, I'm using about 2/3 of a yard. So I would recommend getting about 3/4 of a yard for your main fabric, 3/4 of a yard for your lining fabric. And then for the straps, it's like barely even a 1/4 yard. So if you're using the same material for your straps as your main fabric or your lining fabric or whatever, just add a 1/4 yard to that. But hopefully you can kind of use a bunch of scraps. This is a great scrap buster. So if you have scraps in your fabric stash, this is perfect for doing that. Again, I really want to make a quilted version because I have so many like little patchy scraps that I would love to make like a patchwork quilted bag with this design that we're doing today. I digress. Oh, and I guess if you're making patches, you'll need little scraps for those as well. They're really small, so again, I don't think you need to go out and buy a bunch of fabric for the patches, but you will need something for those. You could also cut up like old clothes that you're gonna donate or old kids' clothes. Like I feel like there are really cute kids prints that you could kind of like cut up and piece things together for this bag. Anyway, just an idea. Really quickly, I want to go over some patch info before we jump into construction of the bag. So again, if you're not doing patches, you can just skip over this. I'll have the timestamps in the description. So if you're doing patches, you're going to need some sort of iron-on interfacing that's going to turn your fabric into patches. So this is the kind that I got. I'll link either this one below or a similar one. I feel like I'm 90% happy with it. I actually got the idea for the patches on TikTok, and I'll tag the girl in the description who I originally saw doing patches. Her TikTok name is Bingo with Low. Yeah, that's right. She's so cute. She made like this blueberry shirt and these cute shorts that match it. Anyways, it's very immaculate vibes. But she used a different sort of interfacing that I couldn't find at the craft store that I went to. At least this might be the same thing, but it didn't look exactly like what she had. So I'll try to find what she had because she said it was on Amazon, and I'll link both of them. But basically, that was a very long-winded explanation. The reason you need an interfacing is because when you cut out your patches, you're gonna have your fabric piece. So this is just a square right now. I'm gonna cut it into a strawberry later, but you'll need the actual fabric piece that you're using, and then you'll need to cut a little matching piece of the interfacing. So the one that I got, there is a rough side and a smooth papery side. The rough side, you're going to first iron on to the back of the fabric that you're using. And after you iron it on, then you're going to cut out your shape. So these ones I've already cut out have the backing on them already. So it's just easier to cut it out once it's already ironed on. So I'll show you kind of the process. That's why I haven't done this one yet, because I was gonna show you guys the whole thing. But first step is you're gonna iron on this backing, and then once it is cut out into the shape you wanna cut it out in, the paper on the back actually peels off like a sticker, and then you iron it on to the actual canvas. And then from there, you stitch around the edges, which to be honest, I'm not 1000% sure that you even need to stitch around the edges. It appears from the instructions on the interfacing that I got at least, that this basically turns fabric into like a patch. And I think it should stay on without any sort of stitching around the edges. But I just think it looks cute, and I'm sure it reinforces it. So we're going to be stitching around the edges of my strawberries. And I experimented yesterday when I did the flowers. Let me show you. Again, this is my first attempt, so it is a bit sloppy. We're gonna be better today. I feel like I learned by my last flower. I feel like I got better at it. But anyways, do you see how like I stitched around the edges of the flower and the edges of these circles here? So I kind of played around with a decorative stitch. You can see this isn't like a normal stitch. My sewing machine just has a bunch of random decorative stitches, and so I was able to kind of experiment and play around with one. I would definitely recommend like getting scrap bits of fabric and kind of testing this out first before you actually sew on your bag. I picked it up pretty quick, so you're gonna be fine, but always good to practice. So I'm going to use this kind of decorative stitch on my machine for the outer bits here, but I also have these like green leafy pieces of the strawberry that I'm going to stitch on, and because they're so teeny tiny, what I learned from that decorative stitch I did yesterday is that it's really, really difficult to do smaller pieces like this. Even this strawberry is like about 2 by 2 inches by 2 inches roughly, and that's probably the smallest that I would try to do that decorative stitch on, or even like a zigzag stitch. If you don't have any sort of stitch like that, a zigzag stitch would work great too. I feel like any smaller than this strawberry, it would be pretty difficult to do any sort of decorative stitch around the edge. So for these green bits, I think I'm just gonna try to do a straight stitch right along the edge. I'll show you. So we'll see how that works out. But I'm actually very excited because when I was planning out what exactly my strawberry patch was going to look like, I really wanted to do like 9 strawberries like I ended up doing, but I was really nervous about space, like on the pocket, to see if there was even enough space to do it. Like if they were getting too little, would I even be able to stitch them? Is it just like too much? Or all of the different red fabrics too much? I was overthinking it so much. I cut out a variety of strawberry ideas. I tried laying out just one big strawberry. I tried 3 strawberries, like in a diagonal. I tried 4. Things just look better in rules of 3, right? All this to say, after a lot of brainstorming and Pinterest pinning and actually like laying out samples, it took me like several hours to decide on what I wanted to do, but I love how the strawberries look. So let's get into making those patches, and then we will continue on and make our bag.
Once you've decided the shape of the patch you're going to do, you need to cut out a rectangle roughly the size of your patch, both in the actual fabric you're using and in your interfacing. Your interfacing will have instructions on the package to tell you how to attach it, but for me, I put the rough side of the interfacing facing the wrong side of the fabric, and then I just iron it on for 8 seconds. It also said not to use steam at this step, so I didn't. And then once that's done, it's time to cut out your actual shapes. And I'll mention, I cut out stencils of my shapes from scrap canvas fabric first so that I could mock up the design before officially cutting into the actual red fabric that I was going to use for the strawberries. I also wasn't crazy careful about tracing and cutting. I kind of liked the imperfect vibe. And I also used the same canvas stencil for all of the strawberries, but then I cut out little differences into each of them afterward. Once all my interfacing was done, I laid out all the strawberries on the outer pocket to kind of see how it would look. But before we attach them, we first need to fold over the top edge of this pocket. So I set all my strawberries aside, I kept them in the order I wanted them to be in, and then I took my handy dandy hot ruler, which is this little tool you can use to fold edges over precisely. And I first folded the edge over a 1/4 inch, and then I folded it over again another 1/4 inch. And the second time I didn't use the hot ruler just because it's easy to use kind of your first fold as a guide and do that second fold. And if you're using a fabric that has a right and wrong side, make sure the wrong side is face up at this stage. We're going to stitch along this folded edge here, and I would recommend starting your needle about 1/2 inch into the fabric because you're first going to backstitch a little bit, and it makes it more difficult if you start off the edge of your fabric. So start with the fabric in a little bit, do a few back stitches, and then when you go forward, my fabric in particular gave me a bit of trouble just because it's a little thick, so the feed dogs were having trouble. So I just lifted the presser foot up a smidge, moved my needle back in place, and then continued on sewing. So no worries if you have to do something similar. Once you've stitched that folded edge down, we are going to lay out this outer pocket right side of the fabric facing up so that the folded edge is on the back side. You're going to want to lay out your patches, make sure there's space for everything. You want at least a 1/2 inch border, I'd say, around all sides. So that's why I double checked with my leaf there. And then we are going to start unpeeling that interfacing. In full transparency, I found the interfacing a little bit tricky to get peeled off. You just have to take a minute and find an edge that will come up more easily for you. Sometimes it takes a minute, but once you do, you can lay it back down on your fabric, place it where you want it to be, and then give it a press with your iron. My interfacing's instructions said to use a damp cloth in between the iron and the fabric. I just skipped that. I used a lot of steam. I feel like it held just fine, so I'm kind of a rule skirter sometimes. So do it however you want to do it. I found ironing with steam worked great. Everything is sticking beautifully.
All of the strawberry patches are on. Full transparency, I started sticking on like the green leafy things. You can see there's like some residue there where I peeled it off. Before I remembered, I need to stitch around the outside of these ones before I layer anything else. So if you're layering any patches, make sure you stitch your first layer first before you stitch your second layer. But that little mistake's gonna get covered up. So it won't matter, but no worries if you mess something up, just keep going.
Switch out your thread here if you want a different color of thread for top stitching on your patches. And if you want a guide or tips for threading your machine, we walked through that in episode 3. I would highly recommend playing around with the stitches on your machine to figure out which one you want to do. I'm doing stitch number 13 on my machine, and I lowered the stitch width just a hair because the strawberries are so small. I want to start this stitch with my needle just off the edge of the patch, so I'm using my hand wheel to kind of lower and raise the needle to make sure it's in the place I want it to be. So as I get going here, normally when you're stitching, you can kind of move your fabric around as you're going. For this stitch in particular, it makes it very difficult and it looks very wonky to be doing that. So every time you kind of need to adjust the direction of where you're sewing, I need to pick up my presser foot just a tad and pivot my fabric under my needle. So I leave my needle down in the fabric, lift the presser foot up just a tad, adjust the angle of the fabric, and keep going. Especially around these sharper corners of the strawberry, at the tip of the strawberry, I have to lift and pivot constantly. So I just go really, really slow. Obviously this is sped up a little bit, but I go super slow and I make sure to pick my needle up in a place where it's not going to make the stitching look weird, which is why I highly recommend that you practice before you go straight into it on some scrap fabric. I also think I probably picked one of the trickiest shapes to do and size to do. It's very small and they're very curved. The smaller and more curves you have, the trickier that the stitch is going to be. So if you have like a big square, it'll be easy peasy because you're just going in straight lines. But I made life difficult for myself, but it's cute, so it's fine. Once all the strawberries are in place, it is time to stick on the little green leafy guys. These ones were even more difficult to peel the backing off of just because they're so small and so weirdly shaped, but I just was patient, got it done, and stuck them on the same way we did with the strawberries, just ironing with steam for 15 seconds. Now I switched up the stitch that I did for these leaves because the stitch I did on strawberries would just be too difficult for this shape. So I'm doing a zigzag stitch, which is stitch number 5 on my machine, and I lowered the stitch length to a 0.9 and the width to a 2. And that just came from practicing a bunch on scraps to figure out what I liked best. So this zigzag is teeny tiny and really close together, and so it's going to hold the patch down and it's going to look cute, but it allows me a lot more room to be able to kind of move the fabric around like I normally would with a straight stitch. I still had to pick the presser foot up when I was doing any of the sharper curves, which ended up being totally fine, but it just gave me a lot more control. So again, practice, do some different kinds of stitches, figure out what you like, and then just go for it. And here's what those stitched green leaves look like all finished. I really like this little zigzag. I feel like it gives it a really nice effect, and you can see there on the back kind of what those stitches look like on their own. And now that it is done, I can lay it out kind of on my bag and see what the straps are going to look like. I am very pleased at this point. I feel like it's going to be so freaking cute. Next up, we are going to work on the inner pocket. So this is one of the inner pocket pieces that you cut out. And similar to the outer pocket, we are going to fold the top edge down 1/4 inch twice. And this fabric does have a definite right side and wrong side, so it's easy to see that you want to have the wrong side face down while you're doing this ironing. And repeat that process on the other inner pocket that you cut out. So you should now have 2 panels of inner pockets with a folded down edge on top. Once again, we're going to stitch along the edge of this fold here, and also again we're going to start about 1/2 inch into the fabric, back stitch a little bit, and then continue forward. And my machine especially had a tricky time getting started on this fabric as well, so I had to pick it up a couple times, but once I got going, everything was smooth sailing. Once you've stitched that folded edge down on both of the inner pocket pieces, then I want you to take one of your inner lining pieces, which is a bit bigger than the pocket, lay it with the right side of the fabric facing up, and then lay your pocket down, wrong side touching the right side of the liner. I have a few things here that I want to make sure I have space in my pockets for. I have some yarn, I have a crochet hook, and I have my cute little Kindle here. So what we're going to be doing is making vertical stitches on this lining to create the pockets that we want. First and foremost, I know that I want 2 skinny pockets on the edge to kind of create corners of the bag, because the 2 sides of the bag are going to curve with the bottom to create kind of a curved edge. And I have found that having pockets at those corners really helps. To mark my lines, I'm using a Hera marker, which is a little piece of plastic with a kind of blunt edge here. It doesn't actually cut anything, it doesn't mark anything with ink or chalk, it just makes a little crease into your fabric, which is my favorite way to mark fabric. So I've marked each of those skinny pockets in 3 3/4 inch from the side. You can mark yours with chalk or pen or whatever you have on hand, and then pin everything in place. I use clips on the side and then pins going along the vertical lines that I made. So for the rest of the pockets, this is basically just live footage of me kind of laying things out and thinking through what I wanted my pockets to be, what I wanted to fit into where, and kind of drawing lines that I felt like made sense for the things that I want to do. So you can do pockets however you like to do them. You can do big ones, small ones. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the bigger your pockets are, the floppier they're going to be, especially with fabric like mine that has much more flow to it. So if you're using kind of a flowier fabric like mine, I would recommend sticking to smaller pockets. And then if you have a sturdier, thicker fabric, bigger pockets will be better for you. I also randomly decided to try out a shorter pocket for my crochet hooks and my crochet whatnots. I didn't want them to sink too low into the pockets, so I also marked a horizontal line here to make those pockets short. So we'll see how that works out. When I go to attach the pocket to the lining, I will be stitching around the sides and the bottom here, and then making vertical stitches along these lines that I have marked to create all of my pockets. And again, I'll have that one horizontal stitch to make those two pockets shorter, so I sort of have a dead space, but I feel like it's all gonna work out. As for my pocket on my other side of the bag, I again made skinny pockets on the corners there that were 3 3/4 inches in from the side, and then I just cut the other pockets in half, which was a perfect size for my Kindle. It also fits my yarn really well, so I'm happy with my pocket placement. All right, it's time to stitch everything in place. So I'm going to do a basting stitch around the outside edges, which is a 5mm stitch length. And if you're unfamiliar with a basting stitch, basically the purpose of it is to hold something in place while you work on other construction, so you don't have to keep pins in there. So it's not structural. A lot of times you unpick basting stitches later. This will all be hidden, so we are not going to need to unpick it, but that's why it's a longer stitch length. Now I'll be following along the lines I marked with my Hera marker. They're a bit hard to see while I'm sewing. I can see them quite well, but they kind of don't pick up well on camera, so I just wanted to show you that I can definitely see where they're marked by the Hera marker. I'm going to start on the bottom edge, back stitch a little bit, and then go forward up through that marked line. And then when I get to the top folded edge, I'm going to back stitch a few times just because I don't want any added stress from things being in the pocket to pull that stitch loose. So continue to sew all those vertical lines you've done on both sides of your pockets, and once they're done, we are going to sew them together. So lay out one side of your lining with pocket attached and lay the other side of your lining on top of it face down so that right sides are touching, and then pin along the sides. And definitely make sure that the pockets are both on the same side so that one side of the lining isn't upside down. Now you're going to sew those two sides of the lining together along that side seam at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitching at both the top and the bottom. Do the same thing to the other side seam of your lining, and then we are going to press that seam open flat. I find it easiest to do this by kind of looping my fabric through my ironing board so that it's not double layered. There's just one layer on the ironing board. So press that seam open flat, give it some nice steam, and shuffle your fabric over to do the same thing on the other side. Now your inner pockets are done, and you should kind of get a look and feel for what the lining of your bag is going to look like. Now we're going to get working on the bottom of the bag. So right now it's a rectangle, but we want to round off the corners. So what I've done is marked 1.5 inches in on both sides of my corner, and I'm going to use my pattern weight kind of as a rounded guide for rounding off this corner. This really isn't a perfect size to use as a guide. It's a bit small, but it works out fine. I'm not too worried about it being perfect. It'll kind of all even out as we sew. And then I'm cutting that little rounded corner off with my rotary cutter. And then I'm going to fold it in half and use what we just cut as a guide for the rest of the corners. So I'll cut this corner first and then fold both of those in half and cut the other corners as well. And you'll see as I'm cutting, when I cut curves with my rotary cutter, you kind of want to use or move your fabric a little bit as well. Twist your fabric while you're cutting so that you don't cut big gashes in your cutting mat. You're also going to need to mark the halfway point on both the long and short edges of the bottom of your bag. So here I'm just snipping teeny little notches, no more than 1/4 inch into the bottom of the bag. So you can see there I have all 4 sides center notched. Now the bottom of our bag is ready to go, and you need to repeat that process on the lining bottom of your bag as well. So here I have my finished lining bottom of my bag rounded and notched is cut. We're going to attach the lining bottom to the lining sides, but first we need to mark the center notches in the lining sides. So we already have the sides marked because those are just the seams, but when I fold it in half, that shows me where the center is, so I'm cutting teeny little notches in the center of the sides of the lining as well so that they can match up to their corresponding notches on the bottom lining. And make sure you're doing that on the bottom edge where the pockets are, not the top edge. All right, we're gonna match up and pin together all of the notches. So taking the short edge of your bottom piece, you're going to line that up with one of the side seams and pin that in place. Make sure the right sides of your fabric are together, and then you're going to do the same thing with the other short end of your bottom piece. Line that up with the other side seam, right sides together, and pin those in place as well. Now the notches on the long edges of the bottom piece are going to line up with the center notches on the side piece. So find those notches, match them up, right sides together again, and pin those in place. And do the same thing on the other long edge. Match up those notches, pin them in place. So now you have 4 points of this rectangle, basically. The 4 sides are all lined up where they need to be. Now we're going to pin the sides of the bag lining all the way around the edge of the bottom bag lining. So I'm going clockwise, lining up the edges of the fabric and pinning them in place. When you get to the curves, it might throw you off just a little bit because you're pinning something flat against something that is making a curve. All I want you to focus on is the edges of the fabric. As long as the edges are lining up fine, you're golden. And when we get to sewing, I have lots of tips to guide you through the curves here. But I don't want you to worry about any gathering or bunching that's happening further into the fabric. So just pin it so that the edges are lining up flat against each other, and there may be bunches and things happening. As you can see here along the curve, things are kind of like bunching up a little bit. That's totally fine. As long as the edges are flush together, you're great. So continue that process all the way around the edge of the bottom of the bag. The more pins, the merrier. You really can't overpin here, and I always like to just have things very firmly in place so that when I go to sew it, everything is staying where it's supposed to. We're going to stitch these 2 pieces together with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which basically just means a hair under 3/8 of an inch. The smaller seam allowance, the easier it will be to go around the curves. So you don't want to be making too big of a seam allowance, definitely not more than 3/8 of an inch. Here we are at the curve, and my 2 biggest tips for you. First of all, go slow. There's no awards for going fast here around the curve. So go slow, don't rush it. Tip number 2 is only pay attention to what is directly below your needle. Usually when I'm sewing, and probably when you're sewing, I'm looking an inch or so in front of my needle to see what's coming up next. I'm also closely watching my seam allowance guides. When I'm sewing around these curves, I'm paying way more attention to what is directly under my needle. As long as there's no bunching right under where I'm sewing in the moment, I'm not too worried about any bunching or gathering that is ahead of me. Because as you're sewing, you can kind of adjust and shift things around. Now that you've attached the bottom of your lining, we are going to just press that seam allowance flat. It is kind of a funky area to be ironing, so don't stress about it too much. It really just helps with the shape of the bag. If you're having trouble with it and you just don't want to do it, that's fine, you can skip it. So that is your lining all the way done, and we will come back to it at the very end of construction. Now it is time to move on to the straps. So take your long strap pieces that you've cut, fold them in half, and we are going to sew them at a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. And I haven't pressed or clipped or pinned my pieces because I feel like it's pretty easy to fold it and hold it in place as I sew, but you can pin if you would prefer to. Once you've sewn both straps in half, you are going to take a safety pin and pin it into the top of your seam allowance on one side. It doesn't matter which side. Then you're going to flip the head of that safety pin inside the channel that you've created here and push it down in there. And by continuing to push the safety pin further in and kind of pull and adjust the fabric, you are going to be turning your strap inside out. I will say I probably picked the most difficult fabric I could have done this with, or one of the most difficult. It's very thick and very textured, and so it doesn't really want to slide or turn inside out easily, but I made it work. It was a little bit annoying, but that's fine. Just listen to a book for a few minutes and turn it inside out. Hopefully yours will be much quicker than mine. Once the safety pin pops out the other side, it becomes much easier to pull the rest inside out. Once you've repeated that process on your other strap, you should have 2 long right side out tubes of fabric. We're going to iron them flat, which is pretty straightforward, but I do want you to pay attention to the seam here and really make sure you kind of pinch and roll it so that the seam is perfectly flat. Otherwise, your strap is going to be kind of wavy and wonky. And once again, I chose just about the most difficult fabric I could for making this seam flat, so it took me a little bit of extra love and attention, but I got it in the end. And this is what your strap should look like when it's all flat. Now we're going to set the straps aside and work on the outer shell of the bag. So first we need to mark the center with a notch once again. So I'm folding it in half, marking a notch, and then I'm going to flip it over to the other side. That notch is on the bottom. This is the top edge of the bag. And this would technically be the right side facing down if your fabric has a right side and a wrong side. So I'm first folding that edge down a 1/2 inch, and this is where my hot ruler comes especially in handy, is with the bigger folds. So 1/2 inch first, and then I'm folding it down 1 inch. Do a really good job ironing here, use lots of steam, give it a lot of good time to press, because the better pressed this top edge is, the easier construction is going to be in the next few steps. So here we have our folded edge, and our strawberry pocket has been laid on top of it, and I've lined up those center bottom notches. I also cut a notch in that outer pocket and lined it up in place. So what we're going to do is take the straps and lay them where they're eventually going to be. We're going to be top stitching the strap up until the first fold at the top of that bag. So I'm unfolding the fold that we just did to kind of mark where we would end our top stitching. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a pin in place there to mark that spot. And then I'll do the same thing to the other side of the strap and mark the same spot, because we first are going to top stitch in the center of the strap. So I need to know where I'm going to start and stop my stitches. Do the same thing with your other strap, lay it out, mark that same spot so that you have 2 straps with pins in them marking the same spot. I'm switching out my thread here for blue thread because we are going to be top stitching along the strap. So starting at 1 pin, we are going to top stitch along the edge down to the other pin and then pivot and go back the other direction. So starting at this pin, I'm actually going to lengthen my stitch length to 3.5 millimeters, just because my fabric is so thick and top stitching is really more decorative than structural, and so this will make the process go much faster and also smoother because my fabric is so thick. So you can see I started at 1 pin, and when I got back down to the other pin, I picked my stitch up and kind of pivoted the strap around. I could have left the needle in, I probably should have, and I just didn't think about it. But pivot your strap around and go back down the other edge, the other direction, until you get back to where you started from. So you're not going to go all the way through the edge of the strap, just to those places that we marked. Repeat that top stitching on your other strap, and then we are going to pin our straps in place on the front of the bag. So to line up your strap, you want it to overlap at least 1/4 inch with your outer pocket. I would say 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch. You just want to make sure that when you top stitch the strap onto the bag, it's picking up that outer pocket. So line the strap up, pin it down, and make sure that the top edge of the bag is unfolded, because you don't want to stitch over the fold in the bag. So you can see here, it's unfolded. And then loop the other end of the strap around and pin that one in place as well. Again, making sure that it's overlapping that outer pocket by at least 1/4 inch. To place your strap on the other side of the bag that does not have a pocket, I'm going to just line the 2 bottom edges up against each other so that the straps are going to be in the exact same place. And then I'm going to use my straight edge to make sure that the strap is squared off to the bottom edge of the bag, because on the other side you have the pocket to kind of help you keep it straight, and on this edge you might need a little bit extra help to make sure they're not crooked. So we are going to be stitching from that bottom edge there up to where we top stitched earlier, back stitch a little bit, hop over to the other side, back stitch a little bit, and go back down. Again, I've lengthened my stitch length just a tad to 3 millimeters instead of the 2.5 that is my default on my machine. And that's just because, yes, it's top stitching, but because it's being attached to a bag, it just felt right to have it be a little bit closer together than the other top stitching we did. So here our stitching is closing into where we picked up our stitch last time. I'm going to go right over top of that top stitching, back stitch a little bit, and then again pick up my stitch, pivot my bag around. I probably again should have left my needle in, but I didn't, it's fine. And then again back stitch on top of your top stitching from earlier, and continue down this side of the bag all the way through the bottom of the strap. And you're going to repeat that process on all other straps of the bag until all the straps are connected and beautiful. All right, now we're going to sew together the two sides of the bag. So same we did with the lining, lay both sides of the bag right sides together and pin along the edges. Again, making sure that that top edge is unfolded. I know we pressed it, we're gonna fold it back down later, but unfolded for now. Then we're going to do a straight stitch down the side of the bag with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're going to press these seams open flat, the same as we did with the lining. And I find with the thicker fabrics like this, it really helps to kind of take your finger and sort of like massage it open a little bit first before you press it. And then we're going to repress those top folds that we did in place. And again, this is a place where we really want to spend a lot of time steaming and pressing everything flat. Twist your bag around and keep pressing all along that top edge and also the other side seam. I even gave my straps a bit of a press. Your bag is so close to being done. I hope you can kind of see the vision, see everything coming together. Next, we are going to attach the bottom of the bag to our sides of the outer shell here. It's the exact same process as how we did the lining. I lined up the notches on the bottom there, pinned all the way around the edge, and now here I am going in with the stitching. Again, it's the same as we did the lining. With the thicker fabrics, I find that curve can even be slightly more challenging, but if you're going slow, if you're paying attention to what's directly under your needle, you should be totally fine. And to be honest, even if you do sew over a little pucker or a gather somewhere, in my opinion, it's not that big of a deal, unless it's a big deal to you. And if it is, that's totally valid. You can unpick it if you want to. But hopefully you will take your time, you'll pick your presser foot up when you need to, pivot when you need to, massage out those gathers and wrinkles directly under your needle, and you will run into no issues. And if you forgot, this is with a scant 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once your bottom has been entirely sewn onto your bag, we're going to press those seams flat like we did with the lining. And I think with the outer shell, it's even more important to do this step because it really gives your bag that shape that you want.
All right, guys, I'm checking in with you. So if you've ironed all of those seams at the bottom, it's time to turn your bag inside out. But I wanted to point out here that you may notice this bag now, like this outer shell of the bag without the lining, looks also like it could be a bag on its own, right? And it is looking very cute. I'm gonna kind of punch these corners out. But I wanted to mention that there is an option of just doing an outer shell like this and making it a bag on its own and not having a lining. Because yeah, 100%, like that's just a straight up bag, right? And if you don't want pockets or anything like that, you can just have the bag as it is. If you wanted to go about that, the only thing that you would really need to change is just finishing the seams on the inside. So right now, obviously all of our seams here are raw edges, which just means that there's no sort of sewing on the very edge of the seam allowance. So if you wanted to make your bag just look like this, no shell on the inside, to finish your seams, you could either use a serger if you have one. Obviously, it's a whole other machine that you would need to buy. I don't think it's necessary to sew cute stuff, make cute stuff. You don't absolutely need a serger. It's a nice thing to have, not necessary. I have a whole video tutorial on how to finish raw edges with your regular sewing machine, so I will link that if you're interested in learning about different stitches that your regular machine can do that will finish raw edges. A third option would be to do French seams, which if that's over your head, you can just ignore everything I'm about to say. French seams is where instead of sewing things right sides together and then turning them inside out, you first sew it wrong sides together, turn it the right way, then sew it right sides together again so that the finished edges are like encased within the seam allowance. You can Google what French seams are. They're very simple, but it does require you to add additional seam allowance to all of the pattern pieces. So that's an option as well if you want to look into French seams. So if you do any of those things, finishing your seams with a serger, your regular machine, or French seams, you can have your bag just be the outer shell. The reason that I wanted to add a lining, there's two main reasons. First of all, there are way more pocket options when you do a lining because you can kind of sew your pockets however you want to sew them and there won't be any stitching shown on the outside, right? Like if we put pockets into this bag, like how we did with the lining, it's on my table right now, you would see those stitches on the outside of the bag. So having a lining allows you to do all sorts of pockets, do what you want to do, and still keep the outside of the bag looking nice and polished. There are other types of pockets you could kind of add in. You may have seen tote bags before where there's a pocket like hanging down that's sewn into this folded over edge here. Like you could, before we sew this down, you could add a little like hanging pocket here with like a zipper or a pouch or whatever you want to do. There's lots of other different pocket things you could do. I just like the versatility that a lining gives you when you are designing the inside pockets of your bag. So that's reason number one. And then reason number two is just structure. Obviously the fabric I picked for this bag, because it's a canvas, like a pretty thick, heavyweight canvas, it holds up pretty well on its own. It's not like super duper floppy. I like how it feels. But at the same time, I wouldn't mind a bit of extra structure, especially because for my purposes, I'm using this mostly as like a crochet bag to hold my yarn. Like I mentioned, I want it to be able to sit on a surface and kind of stand up straight. So having another layer of lining inside the bag is going to give it a bit extra structure. But at the same time, like I mentioned, the lining fabric that I chose isn't very structured, and so it probably isn't going to help me out a ton in that aspect. But in general, the way I designed this bag was to give it a lining to add a bit of extra structure as well as the pocket situation. Here's our lining. We're about to put it inside of the outer shell of the bag. But I don't think I mentioned the fabric content of this lining fabric is a linen viscose blend. And so if you watched the fabric episode, which is episode 2 in this series, you know that we talked about viscose and that it has very much kind of like a flowier, drapier vibe to it. Because this is part linen, it's not fully drapey viscose, but it does have a lot of swoopiness to it. So we're gonna put this inside of our bag next. That's the next step. And after we do that and sew it all up, our bag is done. But I wanted to quickly just explain, because you may get to this step and be like, wait, this is just cute on its own. Why do we need the lining? And that's why. Also, hope you're doing great. Hope you're having fun. I am. I'm so excited about this bag. Okay, let's finish it up.
Now we are going to insert our lining. So have your shell of your bag right side out and the lining inside out, and you're basically just going to stuff it inside as best you can. And if you care about which side of the lining is on which side of the bag, make sure you pay attention to that. And if you don't care, then that's fine too. So we're going to start by lining up our side seam. So I have the side seam of my lining with the side seam of my outer shell, and I'm going to go ahead and tuck that lining right along that first folded edge of the shell. So it's not going to completely line up with the edge of the bag. It's going to line up with the edge of that fold so that when you fold it back down, it's tucked very nicely in there. And then I'm going to use my clips to hold it in place. You'll repeat that same thing on the other side seams of the bag and the lining. And once both side seams have been pinned in place, it makes it much easier to kind of just go along the edge and pin everything else where it needs to be. So go along that upper edge of the bag, take that top edge of your lining and tuck it into the fold of the bag and clip all the way around the edges. So that lining should fit really nicely inside of your bag. It should look really cute. You can kind of get a picture of what the final product will be now. All you have left to do is stitch along that folded edge of your bag. The very last thing that I decided to do on my bag, which is sort of optional, is I decided to do a reinforced stitch at our straps here. So this is what the strap will look like immediately after you're done, but I decided I wanted to reinforce the straps with this little X stitch. You can draw the X in place if you want to in this little area here. I felt pretty comfortable winging it, so I'm kind of just gonna go for it. But I'm gonna start my stitch along the top edge here, and I sort of just eyeballed it about 1/8 of an inch away from the top of your bag. And then I pivoted at the corner and went down along the top stitching that was already there, kind of just covering it up. And then I pivoted again, this time along the edge of the stitching that we did to close up the fold of the bag so that it kind of covers up that other colored thread. And then again, pivoted, and this time I made a little X. Again, I sort of like eyeballed it. You can draw your X if you want it to be more precise. Then I followed that bottom edge of the box and then continued the other side of the X and backstitched to finish it all off. So you can see I sort of just winged it, but it worked out. I feel like it's cute and it reinforces the strap.
All right guys, the bag is done and I am so happy with it. I feel like it's the exact vibes I was going for as far as like the whole 90s craft, like almost elementary school teacher vibes. It's perfect. So if you haven't already, kind of just take your hand and like punch that lining into place. It should fit in pretty nicely there. You can see my lining. I think my one takeaway for this bag in particular is that the lining really is floppier than I would want it. And it's fine because it's cute. I mean, you can't beat those vibes with like the chill strawberries on the front and then like a little surprise strawberry inside. It is beautiful, but I wish that my lining wasn't quite so floppy. It's gonna be fine, it's totally fine. Let me put you down a little more. Oh, yeah. Yep. No, it's perfect. I'm excited to see what bags you guys did and if you decided to do any sort of patches. Like I said, I have a whole Pinterest board for inspo if you want ideas of what kind of patches to do. Really just get creative, cut out your own shapes, play around with things. And I feel like normally it's frowned upon to like exactly copy somebody. Please copy me. This is so cute. I'm obsessed with how it turned out. I also feel like this would be such a great gift idea to make people bags like this. I mean, tote bags in general are cute, whether or not you do any sort of patch thing. I feel like this bag is still cute and useful and whatever, but you could like really go to town with personalization. Like you could do letters, like I said, and gift like friends or family a bag with like a letter of their name on it, or like you can cut out shapes of something they like. I was even thinking like for my kids, I could cut out like characters of shows that they like or video games that they like or whatever. They constantly tell me that I am like boring and that all my interests are dumb, but maybe if I made them a bag and like put, I don't know, like a Minecraft character on it or something, I feel like it could be cute. And you could totally use this exact same technique that we did on the bag here on like sweatshirts or t-shirts or whatever and make other cute, fun things. I was just thinking, I live in like a college town and we go to like games and stuff sometimes, or even just like on game days, like when it's college football season. Every Saturday it's like game day in our town. It's really fun. And I always want to wear like merch, right? To like be in the mix and like have fun with everyone who's excited about the game. But sports merch stuff is just so ugly. But I feel like I could cut out like letters, or we have like a really cute mascot. I could like cut the mascot out and like put it on a sweatshirt. Anyways, I feel like there are so many ideas. My mind is just going wild. I feel like it is such a good gift idea because of the personalization, not just like all the time you're putting into making somebody something, but you can like think through what kind of bag they would use for their personal life, what pockets you want to put in it, what patches you want to put on it, what colors you want to do, whether you want to quilt it or whatever. You can just completely make all these different kinds of bags for the different people in your life. So I just love sewing, you guys. I really feel like I may have peaked here. This is a good one. If this was your first ever project, I'm so proud of you. Good job. Even if it wasn't your first project, I'm still proud of you. Please send me the bags you make, tag me and stuff. I genuinely feel like when I'm making these, I feel like I'm sewing with people, which is maybe just delusional, but it feels like I'm like chatting with you guys and I'm here with you. So when you send me like the things you make, I'm like, yeah, remember when we made those bags together? Let me know if you want a quilted tutorial. Like I said, it would pretty much be the same process, but I really want to make a quilted bag now, so I may film it if you're interested. I also am next week going to film a little Q&A because I've gotten a lot of like miscellaneous random questions throughout this whole like Learn to Sew series. So I'm going to be answering some Q&A questions. If you have any, you can comment them or DM me or whatever. But I think you guys should be in a really good place to fly off and have your own sewing journey. I'm excited for all of the cute things that you're gonna make and I'm proud of you guys. I was just thinking, I do get the question quite a bit when people ask me what I do, especially like older people when they ask me what I do and I say that I make tutorials and patterns and whatever. I often have people say, oh, do people still sew? Like, I didn't know people still did that. Or like, oh, my grandma sewed or my mom sewed my clothes when I was little, but I didn't realize people still did that. And from all of the like conversations I have with you guys, it's like alive and well. Sewing is thriving right now. I love all of us who are just getting such joy from making things with our hands and sharing what we create with other people. Anyways, I'm gonna cry about it, but not really. I just love you guys. I'm proud of you and I hope you keep sewing things and I will chat with you soon.